Hello and welcome to the Clean Energy Pod, powered by SSE, your guide to the people and technologies delivering the clean energy revolution. On today's episode, we talk about infrastructure. Hundreds of billions of pounds will have to be invested over the next few years, but where should the cash be spent? And how fast can we get there? We talked to Margaret Read, Director of Policy at the National Infrastructure Commission. Margaret, thank you very much for joining us on the Clean Energy Pod. Give us a flavour of what the National Infrastructure Commission does, because it does feel as if there's an awful lot of building that needs to happen in the UK. Just give us a sense of the sectors that you're looking at and the challenge we have as a country.
Yeah, so we look at 6 sectors: digital and telecoms, water and wastewater, flood risk management, energy, of course, transport and waste. And what we do is we set out our long-term thinking on what's required in infrastructure terms, looking ahead 30 years. So very long-term compared to what normally happens in government, at least. And what we've said is that we are expecting there to need to be an increase in investment, both from the public sector and the private sector. The public sector needs to increase by to £30 billion a year.
What's it just now, roughly?
Now you're asking. It's about a £10 billion increase, roughly. And in the private sector, we need to see an increase to £40 to £50 billion a year. And of that, between £20 and £35 billion is energy. And that's a really big transition. We need to move to renewable energy. We need long-term and short-term storage. So there's big investments required, particularly in energy, in the transition that's required over the next few years.
And you talked about some of those other sectors as well. Energy is having this kind of once-in-a-century transition that's happening from fossil fuels to clean energy. Are other sectors similarly having this either once in a century or once in a generation inflection point?
Yes, so water and wastewater needs big investment in order to tackle pollution, but also to increase security of supply. So if we don't invest now, we can expect our taps to run dry quite soon. So that's really important. On waste, we need to switch our investment from energy from waste towards recycling. At the moment, our recycling level is only about 45%, which is quite low, and 5% of all emissions at the moment come from waste. So it's really important that sector moves towards recycling and the circular economy. And on transport, we've recommended some new investment in inter-urban transport, which will help trade between cities, and intra-urban transport.
So that could be a train line or something between Liverpool and Manchester?
Absolutely. And then also intra-urban transport, so mass transit in cities to enable agglomeration and commuting, so enabling those places to grow. And we are seeing our second cities outside London being much less productive than those in other countries. So it's really important that we make that investment. It's basically it's one reason is the lack of good mass transit and congestion, and those transport links are really important to enable that agglomeration and make those cities productive.
So across the economy, there's a need for billions and billions and billions of pounds of investment, a lot of it in the infrastructure that the country needs. But aren't these sectors all going to be competing with each other for investment to begin with, but also just people to get this stuff done?
Yes, and that's one of the reasons why we think there needs to be a long-term vision from the government as to what infrastructure is required, because that enables the supply chain to have confidence to build up, and it also makes the place attractive to investors to bring that investment in, which is needed across the economy, as you say, not only in energy and water and infrastructure sectors, but also in other sectors that we don't cover too.
And just tell us, how does the NIC work with government, for instance?
Sure.
So I know you guys come up with some great reports, but how does that then translate into shovels in the ground? Yeah,
so what we do is we make recommendations, not only in terms of what infrastructure is required, but the policy levers that are required to enable that to happen. And then government has to respond to those. And what we try to do is to make our evidence base really robust so that they can't argue about the evidence. They might argue about the solutions, but not the evidence. And then government will turn that into something called a national infrastructure strategy, which will include the long-term policy to enable the supply chains to get ready, and also enable the projects to be developed so that you can actually start putting those shovels in the ground, as you say.
Let's talk about energy then, which, as you say, is probably one of the biggest areas that, from an investment and from a transition perspective. What needs to happen in the UK to change your energy system, and what's driving that?
So net zero is really important as a driver, but it also brings some other benefits as well. So what we've seen, for example, is thinking about air quality. If we stop burning things, then it brings better air quality to our population, which is really important. And we also believe, based on our modelling and the evidence that we've done, that we can actually bring bills down as a result of the transition too. So we think that the net zero transition is really important for the planet, but it's also really important for consumers' health and for bills too. So in terms of what needs to happen, we need to get off oil and gas, obviously, and coal. We've already come off coal, which is very exciting. And we need to move to away from unabated gas too. And so what we've done is we've modelled what a highly renewable system could look like and what is required in terms of short-term and long-term storage in order to enable that to work, so that when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing, we still have the security of supply that we need. And on that front, what we've found is that we think there needs to be 60 gigawatts of short-term duration. At the moment, we're at about 15 gigawatts, so that's a big step up.
Just explain what short-term duration is.
So that would be things like batteries. It would be things like demand-side response, where people reduce their demand in the short term in order to reduce the pressure on the system. It might be things. I'm trying to think of other things. So it could include things like batteries in people's cars. So it could eventually end where we're actually storing energy in people's cars and then giving it back to the system when it's needed. So it's very exciting transformation that's required. So that's the short term. And then long term, we think there needs to be 30 terawatt hours of long term storage by 2035, and that's about 6% of the total energy demand we're expecting by that point. So that's again, it's a big number, and government needs to get on with it. Particularly the hydrogen storage takes about 10 years to develop, and that's really important. And then we also think there needs to be mechanisms for heavy industry to decarbonise as well, and on that front, that needs to be a mix of electrification, which will be possible in some cases, but also hydrogen and gas with carbon capture and storage. So we've recommended a hydrogen pipeline to be developed to connect up these different places that will be using hydrogen. And that's a kind of starting point for a hydrogen network. And similarly, a carbon network to take the carbon from the places where it's captured and take it to storage. And again, that's a starting point for a network rather than the final network they're expecting to be in place.
And the whole point of storage is that, it's 2030, 2035, whatever the year is, and most of our electricity is generated by offshore wind or onshore wind as well.
Yeah.
But what happens on a January evening when there's not much wind around, clearly no solar, then how do we back up the system? Do you think that's that storage point is underappreciated? Do you think, because renewables gets a lot of attention, increasingly electricity networks gets a lot of attention, but storage always seems to me to be the bit that gets the least attention?
I think at the moment, because we're using gas to fill those gaps in the network when there isn't enough wind or solar, people don't think about it. But as you say, as we move to a highly renewable system where we want to stop burning that gas, apart from with carbon capture and storage, we are going to need that storage in order to enable us to rely on the renewable system. And there will be situations where the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining, and we will need that long-term storage in order to make sure people have electricity, both for heating and transport, but also for what they use it for at the moment for lighting. And it's really important as we think about that transition, as people are going to be much more reliant on electricity in the future.
That's a good point, because
security.
Your car is going to be increasingly reliant on electricity.
Precisely.
The heating for your home is going to be increasingly reliant on it. Lots of the facets of everyday life are going to depend on this stuff. So you're backing it up is really, really important.
It is, absolutely. And that's why we've made some really strong recommendations on that front.
So you've made the recommendations. What does government need to do with those recommendations? And what pace does it need to move at?
It needs to move fast. We think there's still time and it's still possible. And we think that the 2030 Clean Power target is very ambitious, but it is possible to achieve it. And it needs to set out a few things. So it needs to provide development funding for some of these technologies, and it also needs to provide business models so that investors can have confidence as to how they're going to get their investment back over the longer term. And then the supply chain will obviously have the confidence to be able to build up and develop the skills that they need in order to do these things. And that's a really exciting opportunity, particularly for places perhaps that have been deindustrialized in the past. And there's a really great opportunity there for them to build up new skills and grow.
Hello, let me interrupt you for just 1 second. It's really important, if you can, to like, comment or subscribe, because it helps more people get access to the information in this podcast, which we hope you're finding valuable. And let's talk about some of the generation assets we have as well. There's an awful lot of offshore wind. There's now changed to the onshore regime in England, which means that's a bit more likely to happen. You've talked about batteries. Well, give us a sense of the mix that we need to have, because at the moment I think it's about 75-80% of our energy is from fossil fuels at the moment. So there will need to be a big step up in all these different generation assets. How do you see that bright new future looking?
So we haven't said precisely what the mix should be, because we think there's new technologies being developed all the time, and it will be possible to step up. And we've seen a great expansion on offshore wind in the UK. The sector's really stepped up, and the contracts for difference process has been really successful in bringing that offshore wind on stream.
That's the way of giving developers certainty over their revenues over a long period of time.
They get 15 years certainty over their revenues, which is really good. But it's also really good for consumers as well, because the way that the process works, it means that if the price goes up, then consumers are protected, and similarly, if the price goes down, then the developers are protected. So we're expecting there to be a good mix of offshore wind, onshore wind, which we're really excited that is now possible to bring onshore wind back on stream in England. Solar, including rooftop solar, we think there's quite a lot of potential there, particularly over the longer term, when you think about social housing that will need to be electrified for heating, and the opportunities there might be to create micro markets using electric cars and solar, for example. We also think there's a really strong role for hydrogen power and gas with CCS. So we're not expecting gas to completely go off the system. It will be needed, but it needs to have carbon capture and storage with it.
So an awful lot of different stuff happening from generation. We know that the electricity grids as well will need to be upgraded to cope with that. What have you found about the need for electricity networks and what needs to happen in that space? So
networks, we didn't do any extra work on transmission because Nick Windsor did his review last year, which we completely support. So he found the need to massively increase the amount of transmission infrastructure that we need in the UK. To get the electricity from where it's generated to where it's needed. At the moment, our transmission system is based on big gas power stations around the coast, and we're moving to places where they're in different places. They're going to be on land in terms of solar farms and onshore wind. There's also going to be a different kind of system because there'll be a lot more distributed energy. So people's houses will actually be contributing to the energy system, which is completely different to the way the system works at the moment. So transmission, there needs to be a big step up. And then those are mostly big projects and often set in place a process to enable those to happen. At distribution, there's been much less attention.
And distribution's close, that's like the neighbourhood. So by the way, I think transmission is the motorway
precisely
transporting it. And then you've got the more A roads around your local neighbourhood.
Precisely. The distribution is taking the electricity from the really big substations to your house or to your business or around the neighbourhood, as you say. So distribution hasn't really been looked at massively, certainly not by government. And so we were asked by the previous government to look at the distribution system and try and set out how it could be made suitable for net zero. So that's what we're doing at the moment. And what we're doing is we're trying to think about not only how can it be suitable to make sure the net zero transition happens in terms of people's heating in their houses and transport in their cars, but also thinking about the climate that we're going to have in 2050 and making sure that the distribution network is fit for that climate as well as fit for the net zero transition, which is something that people don't generally think about. And that join up between thinking about what the climate's going to be like as well as how you transition hasn't really been done before.
And one of the things that I think is if you look at transmission, for instance, that's been a long-term view taken now. So we're getting projects, stretching many years ahead. Has there been that long-term, that strategic view of distribution networks? Because they play a crucial role at a neighbourhood and local level. Is that something that needs to happen at that area as well?
Yes, and that's what we're doing. So it definitely needs to happen. Obviously, the network operators do think long-term. But there hasn't been that strategic view taken across the whole country. And one of the things that's really important for distribution is that you think about the electricity that's required in that place is very local, and you can't have a kind of national modelling system and think, oh, there's plenty in the northwest, but actually you need it in the southeast, for example. So it's really important that you think about it at a local level, and think about the specific requirements strategically for different places, rather than just thinking that there's a national answer.
And at its most basic level, is that things like making sure that, as everybody transitions to electric vehicles, there's capacity on the local grid to make sure you can plug in, and you talked about even contributing towards generation and moderating demand.
All of things.
It kind of adds up.
Absolutely. And it's really important that the distribution system doesn't hold back the transition. It's quite possible, for example, if somebody their boiler breaks down, they think, okay, I'll go and get a heat pump. And then they find that the distribution system doesn't have the capacity to enable them to connect it, or there's a really difficult customer service process. And then they just thought, I'll just put in another boiler. That's what we want to avoid. We want to be enabling those people who think, okay, I'm ready to make that transition, in exactly the same way, and as easy a way as they would if they were putting another boiler in.
And so we've got that joined up approach from the way it's generated to the way it's transported to the way that it's backed up and stored. You talked about hydrogen. That gets you hear a lot about hydrogen, but unlike some of the other technologies, it seems if it's always going to be something that you'll kick off tomorrow, or it seems to be a little while away. What's your view on when hydrogen will be a major contributor to the power system in the UK, and what are the obstacles stopping that happening at the moment?
So we think by 2035 we're going to need hydrogen working for power, but the exact mix between hydrogen for power and hydrogen and gas with carbon capture and storage we haven't set out. We've just said that it needs to be about 6% of our energy generation by that point. Hydrogen is also going to be really important for decarbonisation of heavy industry. The route that companies will take to decarbonise, they need to have some certainty around that. So it's really important that government starts providing that support to develop the hydrogen network, to develop hydrogen storage, but also carbon, so that companies have got a choice as to what route they want to take to decarbonise that heavy industry that needs high heat, so they won't be able necessarily to electrify. Although things are getting better all the time, and it may be possible at some point that you can have really high heat using electricity.
It does seem incredibly ambitious. You really are completely changing the way that we power the economy.
Yes.
And whether it's 2030, 2035, and either timescale is very, very ambitious. Do you think it's actually doable?
Yeah, we do. And when we've been really clear that if government does take the steps that we've set out, we think it is possible to achieve it. We realise it's really ambitious, and we need the private sector to step up as well as the government. But yes, we do think it's doable, and it'll bring massive benefits. You
also talked about heating, and you touched on heat pumps, and that's sometimes a controversial issue because people talked about the cost of doing that. There's been various debates about the role of hydrogen, all this. Where are we in that debate now, and when, again, do you think that sector will kick off?
So it's starting to kick off, but our view, very strong view, is that you need a package of incentives here to enable people to want to switch. What you need to do is to make it as easy to replace your gas boiler with a heat pump as it is to replace it with another gas boiler. That's the key thing that we need to get to. So it needs to be really easy from a customer service perspective with the distribution network, but it also needs to be really easy from a incentives package perspective. And here we did some distribution analysis. So we looked at the impacts on different types of customer, rural, urban, etc., but also different income levels that people have. And we've basically recommended that government should fully subsidise low income to move to a heat pump or a heat network. So they should be completely covered. And actually, it's really important that you think about that, because they're vulnerable to the gas price going up as fewer and fewer people are using the gas network. So that's really important that those people get the heat pump or the heat network first. And then you need a package of incentives which tails off over time as the heat pump transition continues for everybody else. So there we've recommended a £7,000 subsidy, but also 0% financing for insulation and the other things that you might need to do to your house, depending on your type of house, to move to a heat pump or a heat network.
Now, this all sounds great, but also all sounds very expensive for the taxpayer, if not for the individual who's maybe getting some of the incentives. You talked earlier on that some of the work you've done suggests that actually it might make energy more affordable.
Yes.
Not more expensive. Just talk us through that logic, 'cause it sounds more expensive.
I know. And this is because people don't think about how we pay for our energy. Basically, what we're doing is we're moving from a system where we're paying for gas, or basically, and burning it, to a system where we put our investment in up front, a capital heavy system, and then we pay it back over time. And that electricity that's generated is basically cheap, very, very cheap. But you pay for that infrastructure over time. And the price of that infrastructure is also coming down. And so that's the reason you're moving from the volatile gas price to paying for infrastructure over time instead, and the operation and maintenance of that infrastructure.
I think of like pensions, really. So, you've got to invest today and then it'll pay off hopefully in the future, and it'll grow over a period of time, and you'll be able to benefit from it.
Like a mortgage, you're paying for it on an annual basis, rather than just paying for something that you literally consume and then it's gone.
But that's a harder sell than, if I do it today, I can get a saving tomorrow. Do you think that people will have the patience to pay a little bit upfront at the moment and then wait for that jam tomorrow, essentially?
I think that people do understand the importance of the transition, but also the other benefits that will come. So not only is it good for the planet, as I said, but it's also good for air quality. People really care about this. The fact that, lots of people have got asthma and other respiratory diseases as a result of the pollution that we see. And also, I think that people understand that, like a mortgage, you're getting some figures at the end of this. So it is worth it. But I think one of the things that's really important is that government needs to explain this properly. And we've been really clear that you can't just talk about the costs of net zero. You also have to talk about the benefits. And there are benefits in addition to those for the planet.
Let's move on to another subject we touched on briefly to begin with, which was supply chain. Because this is it's a great time to be a builder over the next few years.
Absolutely.
But will there be the people to do the building, and how do we make sure that we have that we get job value as well as maybe some cheaper bills over a period of time, but actually build industries for the long term? Yeah,
and I think that's one of the reasons why we're really clear that you need to have that long-term expectation of what the economy is going to look like in a decarbonised world, and that will enable companies to invest in the skills of the future. At the moment, sometimes it's a bit chop and change, and they don't know whether they're going to have a job in the future. So why would you invest and you just take somebody on for a short period of time? Whereas if you know that there's a long-term program of work, which is good work, then companies naturally will rise up to that and build their staff, hopefully.
Now that makes a lot of sense, but we've talked about the importance of government in this. Governments change every 4 or 5 years, or sometimes they change every 4 or 5 years. How do you balance that short-term political cycle with the need for a long-term view of how the economy is going to change?
Yeah, so one of our jobs as the National Infrastructure Commission is actually to build consensus. It's really important that we have that understanding across political parties of what's required in infrastructure, because then you can start to kind of buffer against the short-term political change that might happen. And actually, if you look at water, for example, you can see that all parties agree we need the investment into water in order to enable the long-term security of supply that we need and changes in terms of pollution. So that's what we need to do. We need to establish that political consensus about what's required. And obviously things will change in terms of policy in the short term. But if you've got that long-term expectation of how you're going to make the transition, then it should be possible for companies to build up their supply chain and the skills and develop as I suggested.
Hello, let me interrupt you for just 1 second. It's really important, if you can, to like, comment or subscribe, because it helps more people get access to the information in this podcast, which we hope you're finding valuable. Do you think there's a danger, though, that organisations like the NIC or industry or people who are really passionate about this, they want to go at a certain pace?
Yeah.
very fast. And then how do you make sure that you also bring society along with you? Because you have a big social as well as economic change.
There is. And this is one of the reasons why we think it's really important that government plays that role and engages with communities. One of the things that we've made a recommendation on is about community benefit of infrastructure, because not all infrastructure does directly benefit the communities that it's hosted by. So it's really important that they understand the national need, but also that they can see something as a result for their community. And that might be money off bills, but it might be insulation of the poorest houses in that community, or some community energy scheme enabled as a result of them agreeing to host these big infrastructure requirements.
And just give us a sense of the scale of change or opportunity that is across the economy in terms of infrastructure.
I mean, it's massive. We're going to see a completely different way that the electricity system's going to work, with people being able to engage directly, if they wish, in the way the process works in terms of, storing energy in their cars and then selling it back and getting energy from their roof, from a rooftop solar, or seeing new reservoirs which bring habitat and amenity, and connecting up habitats using linear infrastructure like pylons and roads, and connecting those habitats up so that we can see better biodiversity and more connected habitats. I think it's going to be amazing, and we've done it before. So just remember, we developed the electricity transmission network very fast. Similarly, our motorway network was developed very quickly. It is possible for the UK to do this.
Why did we stop?
I think that's a political question. I don't really want to go anywhere near.
But that's a good point. What are the big lessons, do you think, from some of those previous changes and transitions? I mean, what did we get right then that we can maybe learn this time round?
Yeah, I think one of them is about the drive and the momentum. That's one of the reasons why we talk about pace. Once you start on this journey, it really kind of generates its own momentum. The other thing was that people were brought into that process, that society understood the benefits of electrifying, getting the transmission network working. They understood the benefits of motorways. Maybe I won't go too far down that road, given some of the more recent motorway things. But I think people understood that this was an opportunity for the UK to grow and change, and that there were benefits for them. And we need to take people on the same journey now.
Now, you've talked, Margaret, about climate and adapting to the climate that we're going to have in the years ahead. We've heard lots of predictions. What does that look like, and what does that mean for all of this infrastructure we're building? So
what we found is that across all of our sectors, infrastructure operators don't really know how to adapt their infrastructure to make it resilient to the climate that we're going to see. Engineering standards, for example, don't factor climate change in many cases. We also found that service standards don't factor in climate change. And so what we think there needs to be is that all infrastructure really needs to think about what service they want to provide from that infrastructure over the long term, and how they need to maintain and adapt their assets to enable that service.
Can you give me an example of what you're talking about?
Yeah. So, an example from rail. The trains are not built to run when it's really, really hot. So the question is, do you invest a lot of money to make the system strong enough to manage extreme heat? Or do you just slow the trains down on hot days? We haven't had that conversation yet. And we need to, because that's an investment decision that the railway industry needs to make.
Margaret, thank you very much.
No problem. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks very much for joining us. That's all we have time for on this episode. But if you found anything in it valuable, please like, comment or subscribe. Or even better, share with one of your colleagues or friends. See you soon.